Sure, thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Bon dia. And welcome to the session of Sustainable Infrastructures and Public-Private Cooperation. My name is Shrey Nag. I am from HCL Technologies, and I'll be moderating this wonderful session. But before we start, a quick thank you to Fundación Consejo España-India, to all the organizers, ORF, obviously Generalitat, Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, for this meaningful event. And let's see what we get out of it. I'm sure it'll be something very, very positive as a takeaway. So around the world, what we're really witnessing is a fundamental shift in how we see infrastructure, design, build, operate, from linear, from resource-intensive models. We're going into circular models. We're going into models which are, resilient and above all, digitally connected, right? So the challenge is not just about infrastructure that endures, but that ensures sustainability when it comes to environment, social, community, and of course, economically sustainable. So this requires a lot of collaboration, innovation, and trust. In my role in HCL Tech, I've seen a very silent enabler in this cooperation, which is digital transformation. We're talking about from data-driven energy to proactive, predictive maintenance, and that's what is going to make infrastructure way more transparent and sustainable and obviously efficient. Today's discussion brings together voices that represent every dimension in this ecosystem. I'm really, really honored, actually, to have with us Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, a VP from Observer Research Foundation, Kolkata and Development Studies, Dr. Jaume, Fellow and Lead World Economies and Sustainability at the Center of New Economy Policy, Economy Diplomacy at ORF, Jordi Torrent, Director of Strategy of the Port of Barcelona, and also General Secretary, Mediports Association, Director of BRB Logistics, Busan. You have quite a lot of stuff on your plate. And last and definitely not the least, Alejandro Jimenez, Director of Global Business Development Strategy at Acciona Infrastructures. Welcome, gentlemen, and I hope we would have a nice session and above all, really enjoy it. So my first question, if I may, would be for Dr. Ghosh. So how do you see economic diplomacy between India and Spain supporting resilient green infrastructure projects? Could think tanks like ORF play a significant facilitation role here?
See, one critical element happens to be the knowledge gap, where ORF can definitely play a role. We had been advocating about one very important element when it comes to the, especially the infrastructure financing gap. Now, if you look at the infrastructure finance as it stands today, or the financing gap as it stands today, to reach net zero by 2050, of course, India has its target by 2070, but generally supposed to say by 2050, we will require to the tune of 120 trillion euros. By 2040, if we have to close the existing infrastructure financing gap and respond to the shifting economic and the demographic shifts, we will need 81 trillion euros. And what are we going to mobilize by 2040, given the present trend? We will barely mobilize 13 trillion euros. So this is the gap that persists. Now, I haven't brought into this equation one very critical element, that is adaptation, climate adaptation. We are primarily talking in terms of the green transition, and when it comes to green transition, large component of it, as far as investment is concerned, is getting into energy transition as such. We are less talking about the nature-based solution or the natural infrastructure that exists, but on the other side, if you look at most of the portfolios of this DFIs, the Development Financial Institutions, you will find a very striking trend. The trend is that around 85 to 90% of their portfolio is getting into mitigation projects. Barely 5 to 7% is getting into adaptation projects. Whereas last week only, the Adaptation Financing Gap report was published, and that shows that by 2023, we were able to mobilize barely 21 billion euros, whereas the annual adaptation financing gap by 2035 is to the tune of 310 billion euros. So it is barely 1/14 of the amount that we are essentially mobilizing. Now, why does this gap exist in terms of climate adaptive infrastructure or climate adaptive, say, projects as such? This is precisely because of the fact that the private sector is not getting into this. It is largely the public sector which is playing a role here. The private sector is not getting into this precisely because of one factor. One factor is ROI, that is the return on investment. Now, what is the problem with that? Now, in most cases, this climate adaptive infrastructure results in the creation of public goods. Suppose, say, let's talk about the global south, the developing world, which needs more of these types of infrastructure. Say, I talk about the seeds, or the place I come from, the city of Calcutta, which is around 100 kilometers from an archipelago known as the Sundarbans, which is a deltaic region, which presently has 102 islands because 18 islands have already gone. I mean, it's sunk practically. Yeah. So, and it is projected that over the next few years, we are going to lose out, say over the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to lose out 10 more islands. But in any case, we have to survive, so we have to adapt. So in order to create embankments, we need funding. So who is going to provide this fund when there is no return on investment? So it's the public goods nature of these very climate adaptive infrastructure that doesn't really show off a perceptible ROI, and that actually really results in the private sector not being really interested, in fact, in getting into adaptation projects or adaptive infrastructure. So as far as Spain and India are concerned, of course, there is quite a bit of interest in the domain of green transition and energy transition. There is potential, in fact, when it comes to solar power, as also, in fact, one very critical element is that we are building this digital infrastructure, and definitely Europe is playing a major role in that. We have thought about, if you recall, which I mentioned earlier, during the India G20 presidency, the IMEC, the India Middle East European Economic Corridor, has also been thought of, which is going to be a win-win situation for both India, Middle East, and Europe, win-win-win kind of a situation. But, now 3 things have been conceived of there. One is the green infrastructure, that is the solar energy. We are thinking of this as a solar belt. We are thinking of this as a green hydrogen belt. Thirdly, we are also thinking of this as a digital belt. So naturally, there's quite a bit of energy, enthusiasm, and finance that will get into this over time. Given the fact that there will be an ROI, a perceptible ROI, but the private sector also needs to be enticed through the right kind of financial instrument to get into this space. But the problem essentially will again lie with this entire north-south divide in the context of climate adaptive infrastructure. So let me stop here.
Yeah, because we would love to come back to the climate adaptive infrastructure in the next round of questions. However, having said that, yes, there is a lot of openings when it comes to the energy area. However, when it comes to infrastructures, maybe there's way more we could do when it comes to collaboration between India and Spain. And I've got my fellow panelists here, some of us would agree that there is a lot to do with India, and there's a lot of match between India and Spain when it comes to infrastructure collaboration, because Spain has wonderful know-how and technology there, but the barrier entries are quite significant. So that's something maybe we could throw some light upon in the next round of questions. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I'd like to address Dr. Bhomik now. So you work essentially on public policies, right? And in the chats that we've had in the past recently, we discussed on how do we move, let's talk about the declarations to delivery when it comes to your policy. That's probably one of your favorite topics, right? So how do we buy these sustainable infrastructures, projects, and then let us know about how do you think we apply them?
Thank you so much, Shreyashi, for the warm introduction. My intervention will be quite simple and sequential in the way that like you said, I'd like to focus on more practical, implementable solutions so that we can move from declaration towards sustainable infrastructure, not only in the form of just investments and philanthropy, but also the ROI that Dr. Ghosh mentioned, so that the ROI is shareable. So let me start with looking at 3 essential steps towards sustainable infrastructure. The first is how we buy them, how we invest in them. The second one is how we apply that infrastructure. And the third part, which is very crucial in contemporary times, is how we protect this infrastructure against climate extremities that are becoming prevalent by the day. Now, if we have these, although these sound like smaller words, but if we have the sequence and the steps in place, private capital will naturally flow in because the ROI will speak for itself. Now, if we add a layer, the digital layer and the AI revolution in terms of how we manage the infrastructure, it makes outcomes measurable, it makes risks manageable. Essentially helps businesses and private sector come in with more interest in sustainable infrastructure. Now, in terms of buying assets for sustainable infrastructures, we need to move beyond looking at just investing in assets to investing in outcomes. So what kind of returns or outcomes that those kind of assets will give us? Say, for example, just to de-jargonize it a bit, say, for example, when we are retrofitting buildings, I would like to see the savings per unit for me as a private sector person to invest in retrofitting buildings and not just blindly investing or greening a certain infrastructure. Now, that is a place where I do believe that India and Spain partnerships can be leveraged to a very large extent, because Spain has a large history of concessional spending on energy and water. And what does India bring into the game? It does bring in low-cost engineering. It brings in scale. So essentially, what could be lacking here is the standardization of processes. We'd like to see a platform where, say, a verifier in Barcelona is looking at the same dashboard as a banker in Mumbai. Once we have that kind of processes which are standardized across the 2 countries, investment becomes more easier and more automated. Let us look at this private financing of this kind of infrastructure as a bridge, like how I would like to acronymize it, because we've been talking about bridges since morning, building bridges between countries. So for me, bridge in this context would stand for, say, B for bankability, where you bank, where as partners you're banking on the solutions. R is for risk sharing, where there is optimal risk sharing between the stakeholders. I could be for innovative instruments such as concessional loans and these kind of instruments that could facilitate the infrastructure that we are talking about. D would be for data. Like, I would really want to focus on this point that if data is not clear, no data, no deal. G would be for guarantees that could be backed by public finance as well as DFI infrastructure. And E could stand for equity, where we can let patient equity flow in and allow this kind of infrastructure to prosper. Now, very quickly, where do we start in terms of the application of the infrastructure? If I focus on the port ecosystem in Barcelona with, say, any city in the western coast of India, we need to start with where decarbonization meets trade. And that is where, say, energy, air quality, competitiveness, and jobs would converge. Secondly would be automation and electrifying your infrastructure, and that is essentially what it does, is that it brings down the transaction costs for your businesses, helps private sector come in with greater force. And the third move, specifically in terms of, say, ports or trade, would be fixing the cold chain, where there should be specific focus on on connectivity infrastructure so that trade can prosper. This is quite a right arena where India and Spain can build into these kind of partnerships, especially because of Spain's long history in automation and safety in this domain. And this is where Indian ports in the western coast could also come in, but for implementation could look at more of a model between two cities and create digital twins or port twins that could essentially show the way forward for other kind of partnerships. I'll just stop there and I'll come back to this later with the third most crucial points of how we protect infrastructure against climate.
Absolutely, but on that I'd like to also come back in the next round with, just want to leave one thought for our think tankers here, that absolutely what you mentioned was, what I would take away from this talk is this bilateral match I always see that exists between India and Spain. You mentioned scalability, you mentioned certain, we have the skill sets in India, we have the Spanish here, they have certain technologies in renewables or in infrastructure. And what we are seeing in the past 20 years that I'm in the corporate sector is that the Spanish companies, many of them have gone, settled, and are doing pretty well. Example like CIE Automotive is already in the, it's a great example. But many of the Spanish companies are going and kind of settling there as with a delivery center, with sometimes even a center of excellence, which is like a great success story. But then when it comes to entering the market, there's this tremendous amount of barrier entries. And it's like we have spoken about this in every conference. I speak to my colleagues and they have the same story to tell us, that it's great, we love to be in India, but then there's so much barrier entry. We don't know the laws, we don't know the legislations, every region changes. I mean, I think think tanks have a huge role to play there. So I would like to refer to that in our next discussion, just to leave a thought to that. And now we're going to be entering the logistics corridor with Jordi here, Port of Barcelona. So we're talking about the India-Spain infrastructure and the logistics corridor. How would you share your experience when it comes to the trade and connectivity between India and Barcelona? What are the ports you're actually connected to the most? What kind of traffic are we talking about? What volume of business are we bringing here? And in general, Jordi, what is the panorama when it comes to the logistics corridor between India and Barcelona when it comes to the port?
Thank you for the introduction first and for the question. Let me give some figures to try to answer your question that I think I were not mentioned initially. I think maritime trade between Spain and India today accounts for 3.8 billion euros. Which represents approximately 90% of the total trade between India and Spain, because what goes by plane is very small, so 3.8 billion. 70% are exports from India into Spain, 30% exports from Spain into India. We in Barcelona handle roughly 40% of this trade. 38% is the remaining 38% is handled in Valencia, and the rest in other ports. When it comes into imports, because I'm speaking from Spain, when it comes to exports from India into Spain, what do we receive in volume? Main products are chemicals, coal, minerals, some things like that. Also, then we have also things in less volume, but which are significant in value: machinery, fish, for instance, important, etc. Fish from India. Not the other way around. When it comes to exports, what do we export to India? Plastic, chemicals, paper, wood. In terms of volume, then in terms of value, the picture is different. So these are the main figures of foreign trade between Spain and India. Which ports do we relate with? Basically, when it comes exports from India into Spain, so basically the goods come from the port of Navasheva, basically, except some liquid bulks that come from the port of Sica. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. And when it comes on the other way around, when it comes from Spain to India, the main port of destination is Mundra. Okay, Mundra. So this would be a little bit the and the previous session was on medical things, so this would be like the radiography, no? The radiography of trade between Spain and India nowadays. Before coming here, I checked the evolution of trade between the two countries in the last 6-7 years. There has been a very positive evolution since before the pandemic. Last 2 years, not so much, okay, not so much. If we look at the growth from 1917, 16 till now, the evolution was very good, and now the last 2 years there has been some stabilization. And to finish with the picture, let's say, if you look at the total volumes at the Port of Barcelona, and the picture in Valencia, I guess, would be very similar, we see that India is the 4th trade partner of the Port of Barcelona. So first comes China, then you have Turkey, that has increased a lot in recent years. You have the US, and then the 4th is India. When it comes into exports from India to China, to Spain. On the other run, India goes a little bit, it's the 7th or 8th position. So this is a little bit the picture of trade between Spain and India. I don't know if I answered your question more or less.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, and obviously we will open up to a question round series. I'm sure we'll have some time. We'll make sure we do. I do want to have a small little thought for you to ponder upon, and during the pandemics, you know, we've seen lots of, you know, Barcelona has something like 25,000 plus Indians, and many of them have certain, you know, 100 pesetas shops or whatever, £1 shops, right? They're still, so during, right post-COVID, a lot of these shops owned by Indian owners were shutting down. So I went up and I asked, out of curiosity, what is it that, why are you all shutting down? And they said that the carrier charges were so high from the ports that they couldn't sustain it. However, what was curious for me, and like just an open question, was that the Chinese shops run by the Chinese were running really well. Nothing happened there. So my question is that, is there any kind of, because they're maybe more in volume, they have certain kind of different kind of discounts. So what is it that our fellow Indian shopkeepers had to shut down?
No, there were Chinese shops that also shut down. In fact, in 21, 2, and 3. But no, it's true that on 21, 22, 23, the prices of freight rates went up a lot from importing, I don't know, you're not from the sector, but from importing a container probably from India to Barcelona, to Valencia, to Genoa. Before the pandemic, you had to pay a 40-feet container, $4,000. Then in second half of 2022, first half of 23, went up to 40-feet container to 20,000. Okay, so if you exported low-value goods, this had a substantial impact on your supply chain, and that's one of the reasons why Indian, but also Chinese companies suffered a lot those days. Then the prices went down a lot, no? In second half 2023, first half of 2024, then the war in Gaza started, the attacks on the Red Sea started, then vessels had to go through the Cape of Good Hope, then prices went up again, and then they went down again. So now prices more or less a little bit higher than before the pandemic, but very low. But this could be one of the reasons, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Jyoti. We'll come back to you. This is really interesting. So now we talk about, you know, sustainable infrastructures. You know, it's often like an abstract idea. We read about it here and there, but honestly, we have a case here which is such a tangible example, and we're going to talk about Acciona's wind power desalination plant in Casablanca. It's such a perfect example, you know, serving 7 million people, if I'm not mistaken, at least, and it's a perfect example of, you know, a smarter, a fairer, a future-proof infrastructure, you know. So please tell us more about this tangible, sustainable infrastructure, which is a super exciting case study from Acciona. Really looking forward to listening to that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sriya, and hello, everyone, and thank you to the organization for having us taking part on this panel. Well, Acciona, we have a very deep and comprehensive experience in developing sustainable infrastructure, in designing, building, financing, and operating all range of public works, from airports, ports, tunnels, bridges, social infrastructures, water projects. And sustainability in this sector is very important because I don't know if the audience is aware of this, but as an economic sector, we are one of the biggest contributors to CO2 emissions. So sustainability, and especially environmental and social sustainability, is very important for our sector. This has been in the backbone of our company for many, many years. Acciona was one of the first infrastructure companies to become carbon neutral back in 2017. And we have certain KPIs that we commit ourselves to, like having more than 90% of all our investments addressing the European Union taxonomy for sustainable development. So now, when Sriya told me about, let's talk about a particular project, we have many iconic projects that we could discuss here as an example of sustainable infrastructure, but I decided to go for seawater desalination, and in particular Casablanca desalination plant in Morocco, because desalination is one of those few technologies that can truly transform people's lives. And in India, by the way, which there are many desalination plants already running and some others under development. According to OECD, there are around 2 billion people without access to safe water in their homes, and it is calculated that every year there are around 675,000 premature deaths just due to poor water conditions for drinking and water supply. So desalination can solve or can help to bridge this gap. But there are some criticisms that we have here very often around desalination. First, it is too expensive. Second, it consumes too much energy, and therefore it produces carbon emissions. It can harm marine life. All these criticisms, we truly believe that Casablanca is a project that debunk all these myths. First of all, it's the largest desalination plant in the world, 100% powered by wind power, by renewable energy. It's a long-term concession. It's a 30-year concession. Right now it's under construction. We achieved financial close last year. So, and hopefully it will be producing water by mid next year. The water price is extremely low. So we're talking below 50 euro cents per cubic meter. So that means that €1 can buy you more than 2,000 liters of water. The capacity of this plant is 822 million liters per day. So it's a huge facility. It's top 3 in the world in size. And it's one of those examples where public-private partnership really works, you know, and this is something that we would really like to see more in India. So we don't see opportunities like this. Absolutely. And to be fair, not only in India, it's very few countries that have managed to promote this concession type model in desalination, especially Middle East. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, they were the beginners on this procurement model, and and believe me that there is appetite in the private sector for financing this type of projects. Not only strategic players like us, industrial players like Acciona, but also infrastructure funds, pension funds, all sort of capital waiting for the right opportunity to invest. You know, so yeah, I mean this is an example of something that, because if is technically sound, is environmentally responsible, and it has a huge social impact, a good example of sustainable infrastructure.
I think it's a great success story, and I hope it reaches out to countries, in my opinion, as far as wide as India for sure, because there's a lot of work to be done, and this is a brand that has done excellent. And this is an example I personally followed up upon because I found it very interesting, the fact that, you know, it's not just desalination, but it's wind powered and everything that surrounds it. So really interesting case success stories, but success stories are rare actually, as you also mentioned, and I'd therefore address Dr. Ghosh again when we talk about the from success story to a broader global gap that we spoke about the other day on UNEP adaptation of gap report of 2025, that reminds us how rare success stories are. We're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, as we spoke, we have the report showed about that developing countries needed about 300 billion euros per year for adaptation, while only a fraction of that funding is actually flowing in. So tell us more about it, and therefore the challenge a country like India is going to be facing. Like, how does one address this gap?
See, ideally, in fact, there should have been a north-south kind of a transfer, which we were always expecting in the context of climate financing. In most cases, it so happened that the transfer has mostly happened in the context of this mitigation projects. And in the mitigation domain also, in fact, largely in the framework of what we call the energy transition projects. That is precisely because of the fact that when it comes to a solar power project or say a green hydrogen project, you can always see a break-even point, you can see an ROI, and you know that within 2 to 3 years, this project is going to be profitable. But are you really going to spend your money on something which, for which you really don't know the break-even point? You really don't know what is the gestation period. So that essentially turns out to be a major problem when it comes to these kinds of adaptation financing projects. Now, here, in fact, I presume that to a certain extent, a Spain-India kind of a framework can always work, and this can act as a global example if we really think of this framework. Now, how can that work? That's the big question. Even in certain cases, say, if I look at the global wealth today, it stands at to the tune of 430 trillion US dollar, which translates to, say, 400 trillion euro, right? The global finance adaptation financing gap is this, but even if I look at the global SDG financing gap, that stands to the tune of 4 trillion US dollar annually, 4 trillion euro annually. If I can mobilize 1% of global wealth, that covers my entire sustainable development goal financing gap and proportionately allocate it, right? So in the process today, in fact, India's wealth stands at 20 trillion US dollar or to the tune of 18 trillion euro. I mobilize 1% of that in some way or the other. Whether it's, I mean, when I put across this point, in fact, in one of the conferences, of course, there were many who got after me. I said that why not 1% wealth tax? Well, let's not get socialist for the time being. There are other avenues to mobilize that. See, one very critical element is which we never ever get into is philanthropy or CSR. Why can't we ask mandate companies, suppose say companies in India are mandated to spend 2% of their net profit in CSR. Why can't we mandate 1% or 50% of that entire CSR basket into, say, climate projects or climate adaptive infrastructure projects? Can Spain and India get into this framework of doing so and get into a north-south transfer? Can there be some kind of other exchange? The exchange can be in the form of, say, when we are thinking about, we signed this MOU, right? Sustainable urban development in the context of green mobility, digital governance, circular economy. Let's add maybe climate adaptive infrastructure in this entire framework and think about a north-south transfer kind of a framework where, in fact, human mobility can happen in this part as far as Spain is concerned because it's labor deficit. And on the other side, tech support, finance support can also happen to India. So this is a pretty fair exchange that can happen over time. Of course, I'm talking utopian, I'm talking hypothetical, but these are the possibilities that I'm thinking of. And until and unless I think of possibilities today, it's not going to happen by 2050 or 2100 even. So you were talking about economic diplomacy. Well, economic diplomacy can work, in fact, in various ways. This is also one form of economic diplomacy. Twin cities was another form of economic diplomacy that was thought of, in fact, in 2015. That was the Delhi-Madrid twin cities. Let us rekindle that spirit. The other form of economic diplomacy which can really work for Spain and India is a trilateral cooperation model in a third nation. Where, in fact, say, we are talking about UPI, Unified Payment Interface, we have a success story in India.
Yep.
We have success stories. In fact, we have resources, engineers, tech, finance, in fact, to a certain extent in Spain. can we really think of replicating a model of tech, finance, human resource together in a third nation, which might be the Fiji Islands?
Absolutely.
So this is another form of economic diplomacy that we should think of in the future. And in the process, this is going to lead to a creation of a better global common, which will affect the globe as a whole. And so, you just asked me that what should be the role of a think tank. Well, the role of a think tank is very simple. There was a saying that one who can does and one who cannot teaches. A think tank does neither. It only thinks and puts across this hypothetical stuffs.
No, but then, this triangle model that you mentioned, it is not that it's not happening actually. I would not name the companies in Spain, but I know Spanish companies who are established in India and they're serving another nation, They're serving Saudi Arabia, they're serving, but it is just not happening in a very strategic way. Once it happens in a strategic way, it can be really, packaged and taken to other companies and as an established model. But it is happening by what should I say, by accident. Some madness to this accident.
UK has been thinking of this framework with India. It has not yet been implemented. Till a point in time, till this dispensation came, in fact, in the United States, in America, till 2024, US also had a feeling like that we can think about a trilateral cooperation framework. With European Union also, I presume some talks have gone into this. But of course, a greater push is needed.
A greater push.
Because in any case, you have one of the big nations of the Global South, which wants to project itself as the voice of the Global South, given the success of the G20 presidency at that point in time, and including Africa, in fact, in the entire G20 framework. So I presume that the opportunities are galore. It's only that we have to give a final push to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A final push is the key. Going back to public policies, we spoke about declarations to delivery and application. And now let us elaborate on, to protect infrastructure from climatic shock. So what's your take on that?
So essentially, in my first intervention, I spoke about the first two steps. And the third one, which is relevant in today's time, that there are extreme climate events. So how do we protect infrastructure against these climate shocks? So the moral of the story lies that only one place, that we build with nature, not against it. That is the only way we protect sustainable infrastructure. Essentially, say, looking at how mangroves could reduce storm intensities, cold roofs to keep your storage cool, and not look at these kind of instruments as decorative, but more as something that gives you long-term returns. Essentially, also using the digital layer, say satellite images and AI analysis of these kind of images to assess the risk, say in tangible measures, say for example the climate risks per euro, per unit of rupee, so that investors are very clear on what they are investing in. So essentially, what does a consumer like me want from sustainable infrastructure? I want my service delivery in place, be it in floods or in high heat.
Absolutely.
What does an investor would look for? He'd look for some form of stability in the business operations. A business person will again look at, say, lowering down costs and energy bills. So the complexity lies in bringing these three kind of wants together, and that can only happen if we build with nature and somehow implement it. I would also, Shreyoshi, like to come to the first point that you made after the intervention, that despite having these models or declarations in place, there's always we have a certain form of impediment and on why these don't get implemented. Now, the first reason is, we are seeing that increasingly multilateralism is under threat, and trade is quite weaponized, and that's just there. We as individuals, we don't have control over it, so that's not something that we can do about from a very legal framework point of view. But what we can do in terms of, say, policy or implementation is to standardize the processes, homogenize the processes, essentially so that say investors across countries are looking at the same dashboard. They're on the same page, quite literally and otherwise. So essentially, that is what we need to focus on to make these solutions implementable and go beyond the stage. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
No, I'm glad you. My take on this is considering the fact that okay, I'm also from Calcutta, a city, from West Bengal, and we're talking about preparing, from climatic shocks. And one of the it's not even a shock when the monsoon comes down, especially in the most important festive months for us. What happens to the city? How so this is something which is. We don't even need a predictability for that. It happens every year. And this year it was quite outrageous what happened. The entire city was flooded for a few days. So there is still so much one has to do there. I mean, it is something that is a recurrent event almost every year.
I mean, absolutely. It's, coincidentally such a wonder with a country as diverse as India. 3 of us are from Calcutta sitting on the same stage. And essentially, we have all experienced the climate shocks that the eastern part of India faces. Like, I still remember Amphan, the cyclone of Amphan was one of the biggest cyclone that I have seen in my lifetime, and that was right before the largest festival in Calcutta, which is Durga Puja, and it had so much of impact over months. And a lot of festivals in India are not just festivals, cultural festivals per se, they are thriving economies.
Entire economy around
exactly.
It, of course.
So I mean, our whole infrastructural planning and governance towards it has to endogenize this concept of climate resilient infrastructure. Otherwise there's no point to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jaume. And going back to Jordi, Foro Barcelona has implemented green initiatives. Tell us more about it, especially the decarbonization operations and all kind of energy transitions when it comes to digitalization logistics as well. So let's hear it out.
Basically, what we have been doing for the last, I would say, basically the last, since the pandemic, okay? We did lots of things before, but I will focus on the pandemic, basically, on the main pillars of our decarbonization strategy. 3, 4 things, okay? I will try to synthesize. First, promoting intermodality, okay? That as many as possible, or as many containers, as many cars, as many tons of goods that enter or leave the port, they do it by rail instead of trucks. In some segments, we have been very successful. Cars, we have approximately 50% of the cars that enter or leave the port, they do it by rail. Containers, 15%. So this is one of the things. This started earlier than what I'm going to explain now. Okay, so and we are still investing a lot in rail infrastructure, rail services, in order to increase this market share of rail. Second, OPS. Okay, OPS stands for onshore power supply. Okay, so we are now investing. We have a budget of more than 200 million euros for the deployment of onshore power supply in different terminals, basically containers, ferries, and cruise ships. Okay. This year, we have also already had 300 connections of vessels to the grid, basically ferries and containers. We have 1 container terminal connected, 1 ferry terminal connected, and then now we'll start with the 2nd container terminal, the 2nd ferry terminal, and with the cruise terminals, which is really a big challenge because cruise ships consume more electricity than cargo ships. It's a floating city, so you need lots of electricity to provide to the ships. This would be the second. This is very important. Why? Because most of the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in the port come from the ships entering the port or while they are berthed in the port. So this represents approximately more than 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the port. So when you have the vessels connected, more than 50% of the emissions of the vessels disappear. By the way, some people have, I think, a wrong idea of the maritime transport. The maritime transport represents less than 3% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Okay? So some people have some misunderstanding of how big the impact is. But despite this, obviously, we are all working. I would say this is a sector, both the shipping lines, both the port sector, that have been working a lot in recent years in order to decarbonize their activity, and well earlier than the legislation came in place. Okay, now we have really very robust regulation from the European Union that forces us to do all what we are doing, but we started early. And so this one more thing. Third, very important, and this is very important not for greenhouse gas emissions, but for the pollution being generated for particles, SOx, NOx. We are lucky to have the biggest regasification plant of liquefied natural gas in Spain and one of the biggest in Europe. So we have been providing bunkering on LNG to vessels for quite a few years now. Last year, we had also more than 300 bunkering operations of LNG to vessels. This reduces almost completely the SOx emissions, NOx emissions, and small particles emissions into the air of Barcelona. Okay? So we have a barge permanently in the port of Barcelona to provide this LNG to the vessels, both cruise ships and container ships. So this is also, we know LNG is a transitional fuel until we have carbon neutral fuels, but this is also very important. And probably the fourth pillar will be the production of renewable energy inside the port. So now we are working, for instance, in installing solar panels all over the port, in the warehouses, in the port terminals, in the office buildings, etc. So I think not only the Port of Barcelona, I would say all major ports in Europe. We are lucky as well because we are not an industrial port. If we compare, and this is something for the people in Barcelona here, basically, or Spanish people, if we compare the emissions of a logistics port to the emissions of an industrial port, they are completely different. We represent approximately, roughly 10% of the CO2 emissions in the city of Barcelona, less than 7% of the NOx emission, less than 2% of the small particles emission. If we compare ourselves, and I don't know if there's Dutch or Belgian people here, but if we compare ourselves, for instance, to the port of Rotterdam or Antwerp, they say publicly, so I'm not saying anything that confidential because they say it publicly, that they represent 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the whole country, of the Netherlands, of Belgium. Why? Because they have refineries in the ports, they have chemical industry, etc. So the impact on climate is very different from a logistics port than an industrial port. So,
and are we also involved in predictive analysis through AI and all that in your...
Yeah, when it comes to digitalization, ports is a sector where the use of AI is increasing a lot. Automation has been in place for a long time. For instance, we have one of our 2 container terminals semi-automated. All the stockage area is fully automated, and then we have dockers working on the cranes. But now there's a new generation of port terminals globally that are fully automated. There's one fully automated terminal in Shanghai, another one in Rotterdam. Still, according to the terminal operators, on the sea cranes, working with dockers is more productive than wind machine today, and according to the productive KPIs that we have, no? But now, obviously, semi-automation is the standard in the market, and fully automation, still, there's some examples, but still is not so common.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Jordi. And going back to Alejandro on sustainable infrastructure in Spain, you know, we had a lovely example. We know very well how much know-how Accion actually has in infrastructure. But going back to a topic which might not be that positive, but something we must talk about is, you know, you've been in India, you've worked in India, you've seen the market, but tell us a little bit about your experience, and because considering we have our friends from ORF, it's a lovely platform to actually share the barrier entries you faced when it comes to regulations, or when it comes to, and how could public and private corporation actually come in, has a very major role here to actually remove those barrier entries. So please throw some light on that for us.
Okay, so in India, we have had a sweet and sour experience, let's say. We are a player in renewable energy, but in public infrastructure, we have not been as successful as we would have liked. We have tendered in the past several projects, especially in water, in desalination. We didn't manage to compete against the local players. I mean, it's a very, very competitive market, but there are more things. I mean, what we ask, for a company like Accion, an international construction company, to participate in any market, we don't ask for too many things. We don't need very sophisticated bilateral agreements or anything country to country. We need fair contracts, fair tender processes, and a stable and not too complex regulation. That's basically it. So in what we have seen in India is first, lack of transparency in public tender processes. That's probably the biggest issue that we have had. Also, excessive bureaucracy, and in many cases, very complex framework for taxation and customs, also different from state to state. That's one thing. Also, we haven't seen many concession models, you know. That's something, we are not even exploring them because there are not so many public concessions. So that's a procurement model that we haven't explored in detail in India. But having said this, and of course, we know the potential of India. We would love and are eager to have more participation in India. And we are looking forward for these issues to improve, and we know that they are in the right path for improving with the current administration. Having said this, what we are doing in India is outsourcing services, especially what we call digital engineering, draftsmanship, BIM services, 3D models, digital twins. That's something that we are doing with local Indian companies. And going back to public procurement, if I could give, let's say, humble advice, right now there are publicly recognized frameworks for public procurement, such as Blue Dot Network, promoted by OECD, or Global Gateway, promoted by the European Union, which is kind of a certificate that the procurement process is meeting certain transparency criteria, governance criteria, value for money, sustainability criteria. So perhaps promoting this type of procurement models or umbrellas where you can place your procurement, is something that could help for attracting more private investment into the public sector.
Absolutely. So honestly, this is such an example case study as well. It's not just about the successful case study, but this is such an important case study because it is a horizontal problem across so many other Spanish companies, preventing huge investments in India. And that match we are talking about, it's not happening, So obviously the question directly goes back to our ORF colleagues. Dr. Ghosh, would you like to address this?
Yeah, I think that's quite a concern. Over the last few years, in fact, there have been attempts to rationalize these issues. This is especially the tax regime. And GST was introduced, of course, there were some issues with that. Now, there have been the GST 2025 reforms have brought about quite a few changes in that. Till 2014, there was this big concern, which in fact the private industries, as also foreign industries in India faced, that is the criminalization provision in some of these statutes, especially for industries. There were at least 26,134 laws, in fact, in the entire corporate law setup in India, by way of which an entrepreneur could have been jailed till 2014. Now, many of these have now been moved to the decriminalization provision, and so the ease of doing business in some way or the other, or the business ameliorating environment, is changing. That is a big improvement that has happened over the last decade, and especially over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, what India is also really thinking of is a more, I would say, business-friendly governance mechanism in the process. And this is also from the perspective of procurement as well. Now, one very critical element which has acted as an impediment for the EU-India Free Trade Agreement happens to be there are two elements. One is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The other is the Deforestation Clause. Now, as far as CBAM is concerned, CBAM seems to be it seems to be almost like a moving target, moving in the sense it's now getting much more accessible, given the fact that European Union seems to be recognizing that this is not really going to be helpful for the globe as such, not for the global south, not for them. But the deforestation clause, of course, is a very important thing. I presume that India is also thinking seriously in complying with that particular clause. So we are just looking forward to the EU-India free trade agreement. And this is also because of the fact that if you note over the last 2 years, especially in 2023, there was some kind of a decline in the EU-India trade volume. That was also for various reasons. That's purely for infrastructure issues, not caused by infrastructure itself, but precisely because Indian exporters were holding back their exports, especially because of the Houthi attacks at the Red Sea, the Suez Canal corridors. So, but India is really looking forward to it and really acting on some of these issues to, creating a much more enabling business environment and
we hope so.
putting all these foreign entities there in place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. We do have some time for 1 or 2 questions, but before we go to that, I would just, from policies to practice, please do think of one word that each one of you would think is really the most important enabler for more Spain-India collaboration bilaterals. We'll come back to that word from each one of you after we take the questions. So, yes, please. El micrófono.
I'm Pranjal, I'm an economist from India, and I work with global boards as well. So let me try to pull the rug from the feet of all of you. I'm sure you would have heard of a person called Bill Gates who suddenly said that climate change is no longer a big issue. Now, what I see happening in the legacy economies is a backpedaling where you have need for infrastructure, manufacturing coming back, and therefore, by definition, polluting the environment. And there's going to be a carbon impact. What I see happening in the next few years, if not immediately, is reduced funding for anything which is called sustainable, for example. So while it's important, I'm not taking away the need for being environmentally responsible. What I see happening is a big shift. The focus is going to move. For the last 20 years, we've seen everything has to be sustainable. A lot of funds were allocated. But as you know, ESG funds themselves have been performing poorly in the last few years. So my question, and I know it's not, we don't have enough time to get the answer, but the point I'm going to raise here is that perhaps this whole piece on infrastructure, sustainability, it could be shifting to a completely new space and perhaps in unanticipated ways. So I would leave it to any of you to comment or answer, but we could have a good discussion over wine later.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, that's something, what we are seeing, because, as a company, we have been fighting this fight for many years, and probably in the desert. I mean, and now what we are seeing is that there are many more tools that are enablers for actually addressing the problem and actually go for the infrastructures that are needed. I mean, maybe not for mitigation, but for adaptation. And especially, I'm referring to financing, the green bonds, impact financing. I mean, we are seeing more access to capital for financing these sort of infrastructures.
If I may say,
sure, please.
It's completely as you say, no? I mean, I represent the port in Brussels, in different fora with the European Commission officials, and obviously the change that has happened in the European Union since the last Commission and the recent Commission of Ursula von der Leyen is 180% great, no? I mean, everything had to do with decarbonization before, no? Till last year, no? And today the priority is economic sovereignty, remilitarization, etc. I don't know if all this makes sense, but I'm not gonna. If you look at for instance, which is very funny, if you look at, by the way, if you look at the name of the commissioners, no? The responsibilities, if you look at the picture of what the team of commissioners for last year and now has nothing to do. No? So we as a port, no? But despite this change, we as a port, we have a roadmap that we're not going to change in this respect. Luckily, ports are very sustainable financially, so we can still do what we had planned to do even without external funding. So we receive very little external funding. We fund everything what we do with our own resources, from taxes to passengers, goods, vessels, and concessions. But obviously, there's a change, very important, towards economic sovereignty. The multilateral system, I don't know if it's falling apart, but almost. But also, today's rulers will change one day as well. No? So the picture we have today might be very different in 3 years' time. What happened yesterday in the elections in the US, also it's a whole different story. So as ports, no? and ports that live within cities, no? And in our case, no? I think we cannot change our roadmap. We have we have our budget, we have our, so this is not going to change. We see some changes in production, true, but still, if you look at the picture of our origin and destination of cargo, 80–90% comes from Asia today. We see traffic growing from Turkey, from Morocco. We see new industrial projects happening in Spain, because Spain, I would say that is one of the early winners of what is happening, because we have very competitive labor costs, electricity costs, very important. When you look at the new industrial projects happening in Spain, Hyundai Mobis in Pamplona, CATL in Zaragoza, Lotte in Monroig del Camp, PowerCo in Sagunto. One of the reasons they say why they're investing here is because electricity costs are very low compared to Northern Europe. So there's some production sites changing and outsourcing changing, but still, I mean, this is an interconnected world. This is not going to change, I think, and this wave, one day or another, is going to pass, I think.
Thank you, Jordi. So finance or no finance, but sustainability is the foundation for future infrastructure. We have to stick to that idea at least. And do we have that one word from each one of you which is going to actually tie up this session as what is that one enabler we need for stronger bilaterals between Spain and India?
Should I go first? Yeah.
Please, Doctor.
I'd say, to just summarize what I said before, I'd focus on standardization, basically standards and transparency, because while, even in Alejandro's intervention, he spoke about lack of transparency. And I also feel that in terms of bilateral ties, it's just some kind of puzzle that we are unable to fit together, which keeps on increasing and complicating the cost. So that would be one word for me where, you standardize and you keep processes transparent so that they are implementable.
So standardization, definitely.
Exchange. So exchange of ideas, exchange of talent, and what is important out here is an exchange of technology. So these are the three important components.
Absolutely. How about Alejandro?
Yeah, I would go for public-private collaboration. It's 3 words instead of 1, but it's one concept.
I don't know, to respect to economic international law. I think India and the European Union can raise the flag of this in today's world, I think.
Yeah, if I would put it my 2 cents, I would definitely say digital transformation is the key, because if you apply it across any of the things that you mentioned, we will have transparency, we cannot go against the law, it's the regulations, everything is kind of way more standardized when you're going for digital transformation. Coming from where I come from, obviously that's one thing I'm obviously going to defend. So thank you so much, gentlemen. It was such an honor and pleasure. Dr. Bhowmick, Dr. Ghosh, Alejandro, and Jordi, thank you so much. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. Can we take a picture together, please?
Thank you, Estrella.
Para una foto, por favor, please. No, gracias a vosotros. It's a pleasure. Pleasure. Pleasure, pleasure, pleasure.
Thank you, Estrella. And thank you, all the speakers. And now we're going for session 3 and the final one. Just give us 2 minutes to get the microphones on the speakers on the next session. Thank you so much.
Muy bien, gracias.